thank you for joining us today on the first of a series of workshops that the Sweeter learning community here at UTSA is putting on. We are very privileged today in having the opportunity to present you a joint workshop between Sweeter, which is an NSF-funded grant that Dean Browning from the College of Engineering, myself are on as a PI and co-PI, that joins together a broader group of universities across the Southwest United States, led by Texas A&M, that is focused on promoting awareness and research collaboration in the computing space. So all things related to computation, including high performance computing, cloud computing, specific computing architectures like AI-inspired computing models that involve additional processing units, clusters of these systems, and even edge computing. So we are excited to be able to have our very first workshop in this area related to AI. So Matrix, the AI consortium, led by Dr. Dirisha Kudithapudi, has graciously accepted our invitation to be our partner in this very first workshop. We look forward to having many more. The next workshop, I believe, is going to be co-sponsored by the Open Cloud Institute and will be around cloud computing. So look for those invitations to come later. I would not want to waste any of our precious time today. We are just happy to start the process of having our speakers talk to us about this interesting subject, AI, and what does it mean. And so to lead off, I'd like to introduce the head of Matrix. She's a colleague of mine in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and also shares a joint appointment with the Computer Science Department. Interestingly enough, Dirisha was the very first PhD granted by the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering here at UTSA. So I think back in 2006, she led what has become a long line of PhD graduates from our department. So we're very, very proud that she's chosen to come back after a very successful stint at the University of Rochester, I believe. I hope I didn't get it right. There's two really prestigious organizations up in that area, in the Rochester area, New York, and she had a very successful career there as a professor and has chosen to come back and to help us in this new effort of really integrating AI into the broader community. And she's just done a fantastic job up to this point. So let me hand the reins off to her so she can kick off our agenda today. So Dirisha, welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for that very kind introduction. I'm truly excited to be back here at University of Texas, San Antonio. Being a Roadrunner, it gives me so much pleasure to see the advancements that are happening here at UTSA. So let me share the screen. And Jeff, it is Rochester Institute of Technology. You are close.
Well, I had a 50-50 chance, right?
Yes. So let me turn off my video just for bandwidth. Sorry. And are you able to see my screen?
We are good.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome all. Thank you for joining us today to learn about the research that's happening in Matrix. So we have a strong line of researchers that are going to present later today. But before that, I wanted to give you the short story behind how Matrix was started and launched. We are just 1 year young, and I wanted to give the story behind it and some of the activities that we are doing within Matrix. So if you really look today, we have AI power communities all around us that are bringing new opportunities. However, AI research, if you look at it today, it's suffering from something called a local minima problem. If you are somewhat familiar with neural networks, you know what I mean by this local minima problem. We are not able to achieve global minima because we are very disciplinary siloed. And for example, today, the AI solutions we have cannot generate trustworthy or explainable solutions that foster human engagement. And we do not have robust AI systems that learn in unknown scenarios, nor do we have AI systems today that can deploy in severely resource-constrained environments. And in order to solve such problems, we really need convergent and transdisciplinary approaches in the design phase, in the development phase, but also in the skill set training. So really, this is a bold premise behind Matrix, and the core mission focuses on human well-being, where we are equally passionate about discovery as we are about democratizing the field of AI. So we are striving to reduce the barriers faced by minority groups entering in AI fields, and I will highlight some of the activities that Matrix is doing. But the research community within Matrix is focusing on the invention, deployment, and advancing AI at scale. And investing in such transdisciplinary AI research for human well-being over 10 years can benefit over 1.4 billion people. And this is a study done by Stanford Human Aware AI Center, and they quote that it can really bring a return of $16 US for every dollar that is invested in advancing this research. So at the heart of it, we have an intellectual power of about 65 researchers under one umbrella, and we have 4 core organizations from San Antonio area that are part of Matrix: UT Health, Southwest Research Institute, and Texas Biomedical Research Institute are all actively engaged in Matrix research. And we are advancing research and also addressing fundamental challenges in 4 research thrusts. And each of these research thrusts is led by scientists from these 3 organizations. Actually, we only have 1 researcher from Texas Biomedical Research Institute at this point. But the core areas that we are focused are both on advanced and applied AI. So for example, neuro-inspired AI, where we are looking at advancing the next generation of AI algorithms and designing the next generation of algorithms that are inspired by the plasticity mechanisms in the brain. We have a talk based on this later today. And this is a fundamental research thrust, which has strong collaboration between UTSA and UT Health researchers. And augmenting human capabilities brings in the community as we are building the AI solutions in how we can boost human capabilities when you are burgeoned with several data points, either from sensors or from IoT devices or edge devices that are all around us, that are spanning all around us. How are we going to use this information and boost human capabilities? And you could think of this applicability in smart health homes or in space environments or in several other environments that require a lot of human engagement. This thrust really focuses on that. And we also look at how do we ensure that the solutions we are building are trustworthy, because a lot of times the AI algorithms or systems that are being deployed in real world could be biased, could be giving an unfair advantage to certain input data sets. And it could also be hard to interpret the solutions. And when we have such scenarios like in healthcare or other mission critical environments, it is hard to deploy the solutions when you do not have this information. So there is a lot of interest in building the algorithms that can offer this fairness and reduce the biases and also understand or build explainability into the systems. And the final one, which is our largest thrust, is the machine learning and deployment. We have researchers who are more focused on how to use different machine learning models in several application domains, and how do you deploy, what types of models make sense. And if you're a non-native AI user, what would be the right model to choose for a specific type of problem? So there is a lot of research going on in this thrust as well. So a couple of presentations today, we will focus a little bit on machine learning and deployment, as well as on augmenting human capabilities. So we are currently housed in UTSA main campus, and it's in the North Paseo building on the 5th floor. And we have 8 research thrust leads that are helping us move forward in the research advances we would like to see happen in the different thrust areas. Some of these groups have already kickstarted brainstorming sessions and identifying new solutions or models that could help in some of the problems that are in within San Antonio area, or that could help advance AI overall within the nation. So current portfolio has about $10 million funding portfolio from all the research thrust leads from the different organizations, and all of our research is funded by federal agencies and a few foundations like the San Antonio Medical Foundation, where Felipe, our next speaker, is actually a co-PI along with me on one of the grants with this foundation. But our trust leads are also supported by Keck Foundation and NASA grants as well. And being at UTSA, we have more than 65% of our student cohorts that are part of the consortium or the broader AI community here are minority or first generation students. So there is a great opportunity to have a broad impact in our research community by making it more inclusive. And the researchers within the matrix have about 25 labs and about 5 NSF career awardees, where 3 of the thrust leads are NSF career awardees. And we have students within our research labs from 6 different graduate programs. And some of the activities that we are doing is reaching out up to 500 students in both graduate and undergraduate students across different colleges at UTSA. So in the next set of slides, I'm going to give a high-level picture of a couple of projects that are ongoing in Matrix right now. So this specific project is in the neuro-inspired AI thrust, and my research group is actually working on this in developing the next generation of lifelong learning AI systems that are inspired by the plasticity mechanisms we observe in the brain. What do I really mean by that? So today we have AI models that are great at solving a single task, or great at solving a specific or solving problems in a specific environment. However, when you deploy these AI models in real world, they have to learn different sets of tasks continually that could be changing. So for example, if they do well on one task A here, they will not probably do very well on task B. And even if they do okay on task B, when we move to task C, they will fail miserably. And when they get back to again doing another task, they might have forgotten how well they've done on task A, and you will have a catastrophic failure in your system. So Tej Pandit is going to talk a little bit more about what exactly these lifelong learning AI systems are and what are some of the solutions we are building in that space. But this project is really looking at how can we build the models that can learn continually through their lifetime, because our brains are considered to be doing this. Humans are supposed to be good at learning continually through their lifetime. So we are building that model with funding from DARPA, and we are also designing a hardware accelerator or an AI accelerator that can perform this lifelong learning or continual learning on a chip. And this would be one of the first chips that is going to be out there. And we are actually right now working on designing and sending this chip out for tape out. So my students are actually up whole of last night, and hopefully we'll be sending it out in the next 2 days for tape out. The other example project I would like to highlight is on augmenting human capabilities. This thrust is led by Dr. Kutub and Dr. Paula Sharman from UT Health. So on the left is a project where the goal of this project is to identify how brain tissue repairs and regenerates from daily stresses. So the team here is really using transdisciplinary AI approaches to perform neural network analysis and test out theories of how the brain processes information and responds to microenvironmental stress at the cell level. So this is a large project that is led by Dr. Kutub. So if you would like to learn more about it, you can go to quantuproject.org. And on the right is the project I mentioned earlier that is supported by San Antonio Medical Foundation. Here we are collaborating with physicians from UT Health and South Texas VA, where we would like to use machine learning models to disentangle dementia patterns. So this is very important and timely in the sense for San Antonio community, particularly because in general, with every minute, there are about 20 new cases of dementia that are diagnosed around the world. But Hispanic communities develop dementia earlier and live with it longer on average than other population groups in the US. So what our team is trying to do is build these models called transfer learning models to classify Alzheimer's and its subtypes, and curating also an open source GitHub repository for the data sets that we are collecting from this 50 subjects, particularly at UT Health, and see that we can open source this data set for the broader community to use. So this project is going to have really an impact, not just within the San Antonio community, but also making AI solutions more inclusive. The other research in the trustworthy AI focuses on applying AI techniques, particularly machine learning and computer vision and pattern matching algorithms in this specific context to study the feasibility of inferring private and sensitive information from several mobile or IoT devices and sensors, and see if you could kind of identify different types of privacy issues that emanate from using these devices and how they can be addressed using the machine learning algorithms. For example, Dr. Murtuza Jadliwala has done a project on how you could actually infer what is being typed based on using some ML algorithms. This is a keystroke inference project that has got a lot of media attention, and also information leakage that is happening via smart lights, how to detect and how we can address some of these challenges. That's one sample project that is being addressed in this thrust. And the last one that I would like to highlight is in augmenting human capabilities. This is from Dr. Sharman's group at UT Health. They're using machine learning algorithms to link multiple data sets and providing complete data sets so that you can actually mitigate potential AI bias. So a lot of this is focused on the application, and a lot of it is also focused on processing all the information that you can see here, the ecological and the individual data that is coming in from different sources, combining them so that, and how do we actually use ML algorithms after we have this data set, and ensure that we can reduce the risk prediction and improve care for different communities within San Antonio. So this is a great example of community engagement and impacting the community directly from some of the projects that we are doing. And as I mentioned, we are very much interested in ensuring that AI as a field is inclusive. So today, the AI designers we are training should mirror the diversity we have in our society. But if you look at the numbers, it's appalling in a sense that only 5% of the current AI workforce is from underrepresented groups. And being at UTSA, we feel it is almost a responsibility for us to kind of ensure that the field becomes more inclusive. So we have kickstarted a project called Project Lovelace with support from Xilinx, where we were able to support or offer fellowships to these multiple undergraduate students from College of Engineering and College of Science, and who have done phenomenal job over one semester. Some of these students have actually published research articles with their advisors. But we also hosted a Tinker with an AI Scientist, where Dr. Jianan Chai from College of Engineering and Hina Rathore from College of Science have done a session with a lot of young women who were able to kind of get a basic hands-on experience in how to work with AI algorithms. And we plan to do an AI hack later in fall. And we are also planning to offer externships in collaboration with some industry partners later in the coming academic year. And Matrix is also very community engaged. So we have worked with the San Antonio City office over the last year in building an AI model, or a machine learning model to be particular, to understand how non-clinical interventions, particularly the data that you use from cell phone mobility, can be used in how the COVID-19 cases were spreading. And this was pretty useful for the city when we launched this project, because at that time it was giving them additional information on how rapidly this is going to spread and how well the community is adhering to the rules at that time. But these models were also published in some of the prestigious conferences in AI, ICML and ICHCAI. And this was like a strong collaboration between UTSA, Southwest Research Institute, and UT Health. And the students were really the key folks who were able to create these real-time dashboards within a matter of weeks for the broader community to access this data. I'll skip this slide in the interest of time. As I said, we just launched last July, so we are actually not 1 year old yet. And we have big plans. We want to ensure that we build the AI capacity first here at UTSA. So we've already started doing a lot of things in building that capacity. There is a momentum. There is strong collaboration happening between UTSA and UT Health already. We have AI servers that researchers in the Matrix community can use right now. And we are going to bring more intellectual talent into Matrix. And hopefully in a year from there, we can build an AI living lab that could be a great test bed either for a DoD agency or for an industry partner in pre-testing the AI solutions in a living lab setup. This could be a smart health home, or this could be a different environment. And we hope to offer a lot more fellowships and internships to our students and focus on community-based AI challenges. And we're working closely with the city on that. And this is aspirational, but it could become a reality based on looking at our students today. The students could be building new startups based on the learning and research experiences they have through Matrix and through UTSA. Later, we plan to become a self-sustained AI discovery house. So a lot of our activities are posted on our Twitter channel or on ai.utsa.edu. So feel free to follow us if you're active in the social media. But we're really looking forward to sharing some of the research activities that are happening in Matrix. So that's all from my end. Stop sharing. Thank you. I think our next speaker is Felipe. As Felipe is setting up, I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Yeah, Derisha, thank you so much for that. That was what you guys have been able to do in just a short year has been pretty phenomenal. It inspires me to think of some other connections that we have, especially for that aspirational goal you have of the students' startups. There's a project that involves our downtown tech ecosystem I think you might want to look engaging with. They want students like what you're training, and they're ready to engage them in internships that lead to permanent positions. So I think there's some additional engagement opportunities that we can have in the future.
Definitely. I look forward to talking to you more about that. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, the growth of Matrix has been truly phenomenal. Thank you, Derisha, for all you're doing. And I just wanted to mention to all of our participants, if you want to post questions within the chat during the presentations, we can come back to those at the end as well. So I'm very happy to help facilitate that.
Thank you, Joanne. So our next speaker is Dr. Philippe Salinas, and I'm very excited to introduce him because he's also a roadrunner. And currently he's an assistant professor of research in the Department of Radiology. And he's been doing some really interesting work in how we can use different types of machine learning algorithms in TMS research that he is going to talk about. And he's also part of the San Antonio Medical Foundation grant, where he's helping us with a lot of the EEG data sets collection and helping us understand how these EEG data sets work and in curating those data sets. So he kind of straddles on both sides, and I think it's been a great research partnership, and I'm excited to learn more about his research and share more about his research with you all. Felipe, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Derisha. So as Derisha mentioned, I work in a bunch of different types of avenues, kind of between engineering and medicine. I'm a PhD, so I don't see patients, but we do actually do treatment plans and develop treatment plans using neuroimaging to combat certain disorders. So today I'm going to be talking more on the application side of things about what I actually do at the Research Imaging Institute, which is part of the UT Health San Antonio system. We recently completed a clinical trial where we did transcranial magnetic stimulation, which I'll get into what that is, to treat combat-related PTSD. San Antonio is military city, USA. We have a lot of military veterans in town. We have a lot of a population that's involved with this type of a disorder. So we're interested in combating it, as well as learning from it and developing new strategies for how to address this very traumatic disorder. So this is in collaboration with the VA, the local VA, STV, HCS. I'm a assistant professor here, as well as a research cell scientist there. If you need to get a hold of me, my email is there. This disclaimer, basically, this is not a DoD or VA or US government view. This is my personal view. So whatever I present is going to be my own personal opinion. My collaborators span the UT Health Science Center. Dr. Peter Fox is the main person behind this project, as well as Dr. Alan Peterson, who's the head of the consortia that we worked with for these specific neuroimaging cores. The other sites that we worked with were Laurel Ridge Treatment Center, which is also based in San Antonio, and a couple of other VA systems across the US. Funded by DoD as well as VA. So our funding was from those different agencies. So combat-related PTSD, again, this is more of an application side of what we can use ML and AI for. We're looking specifically in San Antonio. We have a high preponderance of vets and active duty military that come back from Iraq and Afghanistan that have PTSD. These are people that have been doing it doing military activities for decades at some point in some cases, and they come back from their deployments and they're very chronically debilitated by this particular disorder. So the current technologies, the current therapies that are available for this type of treatment that we have for PTSD aren't very well. So typically the pharmacotherapies, we're not really focusing them on PTSD treatments. They're typically depression drugs or some kind of anxiety medication. They're not designed for PTSD, so they're not effective in a large population of the patients. So what's been developed is these more trauma-focused kind of cognitive behavioral therapies, which basically look at the root of their trauma and try to expose them to that over time. Prolonged exposure is a form of that, in which they basically deal with these problems and learn how to kind of stent off any kind of bad emotions or things that they're going to have problems with in the future. So this works in civilian and military populations. There are people that aren't in the military that have PTSD. This works the same way in both cases. So it's not just a combat-related issue, but because we're working in a combat population, that's where it's aimed to. Again, this is based off of work that we've done with 2 different consortia that we've worked with, StrongStar and the Consortium to Alleviate PTSD, CAP. They're both San Antonio based and VA affiliated, DoD affiliated, and they're run by Alan Peterson. So when for our aspect of the neuroimaging core in CAP and StrongStar, we were focused specifically on the way the brain looks and how it's different between PTSD groups. This is a very dense source of information for ML and AI approaches, because we have a lot of information in these images. When people think of imaging, they might think of an MRI or an X-ray or something like that. We have a lot more different types of MRIs and other types of neuroimaging that we can acquire in order to get different aspects, basically different views of how certain tissues are interacting or certain functions are relaying across networks. So typically when you're doing a neuroimaging study, you're going to acquire a structural MRI, which is typically what people see here. It shows you tissue layers, shows you the shape of tissues, the density of neurons, possibly depending on the type of pulse sequences you're doing. We can also look at white matter tractography. We can see how these areas are connecting to each other using these tractography maps. We can parcellate the brain using ML approaches, where we basically say, okay, these areas seem to be talking to each other more than they're talking to others. They might be doing something together. So we get maps of what the brain kind of features look like across the different areas of the brain. I want to specify here, we're not saying that one area does one thing and that's all it does. We're saying that these areas are part of a larger network, and we can monitor that network activity to see if it's different between a PTSD patient or a control patient, or any other disorder for that matter. So another way that we can look at this is through the functional side. Instead of looking at structure itself, the actual cells that we're looking at, we can look at how these cells communicate. Typically, we do that by looking at blood flow. So the blood flow maps that we make, we can do it in fMRI using what's basically looking at the oxygen level dependence, BOLD signal. We can do that typically in what's called a task or resting state scan. The task scan for PTSD studies would be something like sit in the scanner, think about your trauma, and then we're going to see what part of the brain lights up when you think about your trauma. We're going to say that's the part of the brain that we want to interact with. That's a task fMRI where you're doing a specific activity during the scan. Resting state is more generic. It's easier to do. In my case, in my opinion, my humble opinion, which is not DoD and VA sanctioned, is that resting state is more valuable because we can get more network connections out of that. Typically, resting state, you lie in the scanner. We tell you don't fall asleep, try to stay still. Motion is very important, not to move. And basically, we look at these small alterations in the signal. We see that there's small signal changes as the scan is going on across this whole area of the brain. So we get the whole brain map and how it's changing in time, and we can process that to basically figure out which areas of the brain are talking, how loudly they're talking, who they're talking to, et cetera. We can also do other types of functional imaging, which in our case, we use PET, positron emission tomography. In this case, you inject a radio tracer inside the body, and as it decays, you can measure its activity levels. So if you're looking for blood flow, you can get maps of that. If you're looking for metabolism, you can do that as well. So for our specific cases, for looking at PTSD in our San Antonio population or Texas-based population, We first wanted to find out, is there actually an area of the brain that is involved with PTSD that is not the same in controls? So we started a study with the Strong Star group back in the early 2000s, where we looked at this, and we're essentially looking at neuroimaging changes between groups and seeing if they actually show up as an area that we're concerned and possibly able to treat. So in this study, it's a smaller study. We did 50 patients that were PTSD, 51. We also did a different version of controls, which is combat exposed controls. These are people who went to Iraq and Afghanistan, came back, and they said they didn't have PTSD, but they were still exposed to things. And then civilian controls. These are age matched, gender matched. This is a general trial that we did. So one way that we can actually assess differences between these groups is to do very data-driven approaches. What we do is essentially look at a resting state scan, for example, and we just see how it's connecting and what areas are talking to each other at the same time. Whether positive or negative way, we don't really care. We just want to know the map of where things are happening. And then from there, we can do regression techniques and figure out what directions things are and what connection strengths are, et cetera. So a very generic way of doing this is what's called independent component analysis. We take these signals and see how they're changing over time and then figure out which networks are created from that. So there's generic maps that we have of the brain. These are typical networks that pop out of typical brain activity. We see frontal parietal networks, which are processing areas. Default mode is another network that people might have heard of. That's typically what happens when you're not doing anything. It's the background activity that kind of keeps things keeps the homeostasis in your brain and things working right. Executive centers are typically where you do processing, you think about things and you create an action, you actually do something. It's planning, motor planning, et cetera. There's a bunch of these different networks. What we're interested in is, are any of these networks different in PTSD patients compared to controls? Main reason is because when we look at structural scans, we look at the MRI, structural MRIs, we don't really see any differences in PTSD patients. They don't have traumatic brain injuries that show, hey, there's an area of the brain that's obviously affected. We're looking more at the functional side because that seems to be where things are happening. So in this study, we did this is a very busy slide, but basically I just want to give you an overview of, we look at different networks and we can see between the groups, the red is controls, trauma exposed controls is green, blue is the PTSD patients. We can see how in these networks, there are different communication strengths for each of these groups. Some of them have more influence on these networks, or these networks are more involved with those specific populations. Others are not. So in the auditory system, which makes sense, there's a lot of PTSD activity. People hear a loud bang, gunshots, they think of their trauma. A backfire, they think of their trauma. Auditory networks seem to be highly active, as well as executive networks, planning, what am I going to do if this happens, et cetera. Frontal parietal is also involved with those. Default mode, as well as visual networks are involved as well. So this gives us a kind of framework for where to look for PTSD if we wanted to do a trial. What areas of the brain we might want to be interested in looking at. More importantly, where can we treat if there are areas that we can treat? So in this Strong Star study, we also did a comparison to look at how these networks are relating to the actual symptom scores. So PTSD has a scoring system, and in that system, there's different types of PTSD symptoms. So avoidance, are you actively avoiding your trauma? Do you look to not be in, to regurgitate those emotions? Do you look to avoid any kind of conflict or any kind of memory of that? Re-experiencing, do you have flashbacks? Do you have thoughts that remind you of the specific trauma that you had? There's a couple of other symptoms, but these are the ones that we typically see that correlate with these brain activities. So in these certain areas, we see these areas light up and we see that they're tracking with the level of PTSD this person has in this specific symptom. So the worse the symptom, the higher the activity or lower the activity, whether it's anti or positively correlated. So we have ideas of where to look and also what to look for in PTSD patients. We can also look, because we're doing this in an ICA approach, how these areas are connected and talking across networks. So not just what's happening within the network, but between networks. We also know that these areas are correlating with symptom scores as well. I'm kind of briefly going through these slides because these are the background material for what we're doing, not necessarily the actual trial that we just finished. So these ideas give us an area of where to look. Now we want to know where we can actually reach that we can treat what can we do to actually affect this area and make the PTSD patients better? One of the areas that we look at is what's called the limbic system. You don't need to be a neuroanatomist to know this, but essentially in the front part of your brain down here on the left, we have an area that's towards the bottom part right above your eyes that's called the anterior cingulate. That part is involved in the limbic system, which is basically your emotion processing center. So in PTSD, we see that the PTSD patients have a more active anterior cingulate. It's called the subgenual cingulate. Basically, it's this red area right here. We want to interact with that area to kind of tone it down a little bit, to make it not so active. Because we see that the more active it is, the stronger your PTSD scores, as well as something called the Beck Depression Inventory. That's your depression score. Depression and PTSD are comorbid with each other. So typically, people will have PTSD, they don't like it, they eventually become depressed, and other symptoms start to follow. So the idea is if we can treat this area using some kind of technology, can we make these scores better? Can we make them feel better? Long term, not cure, but basically mediate what their symptoms are. We'd like to cure, but it's very, very hard to do that. So the idea here is we have a target area. Can we actually do anything with it? So this trial that we designed that we just finished, this is part of our CAP consortium trial. We developed a treatment trial where we actually were designing a treatment that can interact with that subgenual cingulate area, that deep part of the brain that we can't really get to unless we do some kind of surgery. We want to interact with it in a non-invasive way so that we can do it in outpatient manners and basically give people better outcomes with not so permanent of a treatment. Medications can be used to treat this, but again, they have their own side effects. People feel worse sometimes when they take these medications. So we have a different option for using what's called transcranial magnetic stimulation to interact with these areas. And I'll get into a little bit what that is. Just a quick overview of what the project actually was doing. We're going to develop a treatment using TMS to treat someone's brain. We're going to interact with that brain network that connects to subgenual cingulate. We're going to do this in patients that are at Laurel Ridge Treatment Center. We've already done the trial. And we wanted to look for changes in these brain networks that we create in these areas. So from this, we developed a treatment trial that's going to do this for 20 days. These are inpatient treatments, meaning that the patients come to SAMC Medical Center. They are referred to Laurel Ridge from SAMC, military people, active duty, some of them VA as well. And they go to Laurel Ridge, they're inpatient, they're going to be there for 30 days getting treated for PTSD using normal therapy. What we're doing with this trial is adding TMS to half of those patients that we see and see if the difference between the TMS plus therapy versus the therapy group alone has any kind of distinguishable differences between groups. So I've talked a bunch about TMS already. What actually is it? Essentially, it's a big capacitor that we hook a coil to, and we discharge that capacitor, creating a current. That current creates a time-varying magnetic field inside the brain. And that induces this electric field in the neurons, which means we can turn on or turn off or up or down regulate specific parts of the brain, depending on where we put this coil. So if we know a specific location of what we want to interact with, we could put the coil over that location, turn up the current, and hopefully get deep enough to stimulate it. Again, the shape of this coil, typically, this is a figure-8 coil. That's typically what's used in the clinic. We can change the shape of these to fit specific targets, but typically we use what's called the figure-8 coil for treatments. It is non-invasive. You turn it on, you turn it off, and then after that, it's done. You don't have any kind of scarring or tissue ablation or any kind of surgery that needs to be done. It is relatively painless, but sometimes in the treatments, when we put it over specific nerves, you might get some kind of a tapping stimulation that creates kind of a discomfort. It's not intolerable though, it's just kind of annoying. It is FDA approved to treat depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, as well as neurosurgical cortical mapping. It is not currently FDA approved to treat PTSD, but we do use it off-label for PTSD treatments. We're in the process now of actually seeking FDA approval for PTSD clearance. A quick overview of our technology at the RE. The Research Imaging Institute is where I work. Dr. Fox, seen in this picture on the left. Eventually, we started doing this. I wasn't part of the original group, but we were using TMS back in the early 90s to look at actual blood flow changes real time during concurrent PET imaging. So in this case, as you can see, Dr. Fox was holding the coil along the patient's head. We're injecting radio tracer and they're scanning them, getting a real-time picture of what the brain is doing while TMS is on. This is not very accurate. It's not very safe for Dr. Fox to be standing there next to radioactive materials, but that's how we used to do it because that's how science was done back in those days. Now we've advanced it a little bit. We've used robotics now. This is our first generation robot where we actually can program where on the head it should go. We can digitize it using this red digitizer here, digitize their head so it gives an idea of what it wants to interact with, what space it needs to work with. And we can also create safety limits on where it can and cannot go, et cetera. So that's solving the problem of actually putting the coil on the head in an accurate way. When we get to these neural stimulations where we actually do active recording of what's happening in the brain during TMS, we see that the areas that we think would be higher, the closer you get to the coil, the higher the field strengths are. And so the further away they decay nonlinearly, but we do see that if you place the coil over a specific area of cortex while they're in the scanner, the areas that show up being active are actually deeper in the brain. And so that doesn't make sense. It's kind of counterintuitive. These are weaker electric fields. Why would they be causing an activity of blood flow here as opposed to some area here that's closer to the coil? The current theory is what's called the cortical cosine or cortical column cosine theory, developed by Dr. Fox, which thinks that the way that these neurons are orienting themselves with this electric field, the more parallel they get, basically the more effective those E fields are. And so even though these areas are weaker in absolute electric field strength, they are more aligned, so they're more likely to be stimulated. These areas here as well could be stimulated, but the areas that are perpendicular, not so much. We've been testing this theory since 2004. It's been validated a few times, and it's currently the main approach that people use. We can also do this for not just local activity. So if we want to stimulate this part of the brain, what happens locally, we also can see how it changes the rest of its connections. So it does show network connectivity across the whole brain space, meaning that if we do whole brain mapping, we can figure out how this specific stimulus is interacting with the whole network. And we can do that using statistical mapping and connectivity mapping. So all these are informing our current planning for how we do these treatments. So all the PTSD treatments that we've been doing, we've been using all of this information and robotics systems to do this. So typically what we do is we get someone in for a scan, we get MRIs, we get resting state scans, we process those scans, we figure out where we want to target, and then we can use our treatment planning tool to actually say, okay, this is the area we want to work with. We have a model of their head. We know where the robot can and cannot go. And we also know what fields are most effective, which orientations of the coil need to be delivered to get the best response. We're also including biophysical models of the coils. So as we put them in this space, how are they actually delivering that electric field? What are the local and remote contributions of that electric field that interact with that total electric field? So there's a lot of modeling of the electric fields that goes into this. Machine learning can definitely help with this. If we know the direction of these current flows, we can figure out the magnetic and electric fields that are created and see which options give us the best alignment with the particular target that we're looking at. Currently, it's literally just me looking at this from experience and using my own intuition for how these fields work. I'd like a computer to correct me on this. So we're currently working with Derisha on this and getting the planning stages of this ironed out a little better. So again, once we have a plan, we know where we want to go, we can actually deliver these treatments. We digitize the person's head, get a map of what it looks like in real space, tell the robot that it needs to go to its location. It creates a path plan and goes to those spots. We don't operate so much on the robot movement side. We do have roboticists at Southwest Research that work with us doing this, but we basically work on the TMS imaging and planning stages. So for PTSD specifically, we know that we want to interact with subgenual cingulate, which is pretty deep, pretty far down in the middle of the brain. We can't actually reach it with TMS. It's too deep to get to. So what we're doing instead is targeting an area called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, DLPFC. Essentially, we want to target this blue area here and see how it's connecting, and then make sure that we're targeting an area that's going to the spot that we want to go to. So the problem that we have is this blue area is very big. DLPFC is very huge. We want to separate it into components. We want to make sure that it's actually going to the area we want to go to. So this area that's more anterior, this red area, actually goes to this subgenual cingulate area that we want to attach to. I'm going to start going through some of these slides a little faster for the sake of time, but essentially we can do k-means approaches, clustering algorithms to kind of figure out how these connectivity maps are working and get ideas of where we want to target. So for this, we developed the treatment trial. This is our PTSD study, which we just completed. This is the affiliation with Laurel Ridge that we did, where we took in 129 patients, all PTSD. They're all chronic PTSD. These are the highest levels that we can get of people that have PTSD. We involved them in the study. We randomized them. Of those, about 100 of them completed the study. So we have about 50 in each group, 54 or 56, something like that in each group. And we have not only assessments for PTSD and how they're changing with the treatments they're getting, we also have imaging at 2 time points as well. So the interventions, they get prolonged exposure therapy twice a week. They would get daily group trauma-focused CBT, as well as either active or sham IRTMS treatments. So they would get a daily routine of these different interventions. And active just means that they have the coil is actually delivering pulses. Sham, it delivers sounds, but it's not actually delivering a field. So from this study, we saw that as our treatments developed, baseline is when they were scanned initially. As they go through the treatment, they go through 3 weeks of treatment, 20 days, every day. We see that our red line, which is our active group, actually starts dissociating from the sham group. It starts getting towards different on the PTSD scores. These differences not only are different at the time of the conclusion of treatment, when they go back home to their actual base or get redeployed in some of these cases, we see that when we follow up with them, their actual level of PTSD keeps declining. Whereas with the sham group, even though they are improving as they're in therapy, when they go back home, they relapse. They go back to having PTSD symptoms in the similar way that they did before. This gives us an idea of how long we need to treat, how long between treatments we need to intervene. But it also tells us that TMS is actually doing something to PTSD. Another thing, this is just the effect size, basically the strength of the activity, the treatment effect. One thing to point out is that when we do the imaging, we acquire at baseline. So when they come in, everyone's the same. And then when they leave treatment, we acquire at the final treatment day. So our 3-week treatment is where we get our final fMRI scan. So we saw this after we were designing the experiment. We saw this difference. We would like to have gotten a follow-up scan for MRI here to show differences, but we did not. A lot of these cases, they're redeployed or off in Japan somewhere else. We can't get a hold of them. We can call them, but we can't actually scan them. Not only do the PTSD symptoms change, but also the depression scores change. So in the red group, the active group, we see differences in long-term follow-up for depression as well. And again, the effect sizes are different for the active group. Basically, they got better. Even though they had the exact same therapy, the group that got TMS with the therapy got a little bit better, in some cases a lot. So now looking at the imaging, how do we actually see this connectivity change? Did we actually see from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, did it interact with the area we were targeting? From this map, we do see an effect size that shows that subgenual cingulate was actually activated. In this case, we're treating it, it decreases the hyperactivity in the active group. So we can do that with functional connectivity mapping. We can also do that with similar mapping that's using what's called blood flow. So we're looking at an MRI version of blood flow measurements. We see that in this specific one, which is the top line, is the strength of this blood flow. We see changes in the pre and post-treatment groups in specific areas. We also see in the connectivity, the spread of these regions, how they're affected. When we're looking at subgenual cingulate, that's this area right here in the middle. We do see that in the active IRTMS group, we did see a decrease in blood flow. to that area, meaning that it's decreasing its activity level. So the hope is that we're making that area that we're trying to target for subgenual cingulate less active in the PTSD patients, which we know correlates with better symptom outcomes. So these are just fancy maps, whole brain analysis of what we looked at. DMN is right here. That's also activated more in the active group. Again, we can do symptom correlation scores across these treatments and show that as not only do these areas affected by PTSD, but they get better with the treatment that we're giving them. When we parse this post-treatment response into groups, we see that the active group actually got much better than the sham group, even though both got better. So the therapy works. The therapy that they're getting, the verbal therapy that they're getting works, but the active TMS actually works a little bit more. So study conclusions, generically, we have these maps. We know that these maps exist. We can treat these areas. We can use TMS to do that. We can use therapy to do that. We can report on these findings and get better outcomes for patients. I'm going to breeze through this a little bit for time. Our next steps, we're already introducing our new version of the robotic system. This is our C3 STIM, cortical column cosine stimulation model for clinical use. It's a cobot, collaborative robot, so we can actually manipulate it a little better and plan better so we can move around the head a lot easier. We're utilizing with Derisha's group a machine learning AI approach to optimize our TMS planning and delivery. This will help patient outcomes because we're giving better treatments from the start. We don't waste our time looking at areas that we can't actually reach. On the PTSD side, we'd like to validate this approach in a more direct treatment. Instead of doing a treatment which is PTSD therapy plus TMS compared to just PTSD therapy, we'd like to do it in a more general sense, using different aiming approaches, different types of ways to investigate those areas. We want to look at session limits, how many times can we deliver a session so that we can increase the duration of the effects, as well as the long-term effects of these TMS effects. How long can they last without getting TMS before they need another session? We'd want to develop outpatient clinical trials, not inpatient only. That'll help us get more imaging as well. And that's where the AI approaches will start coming in, because on that side, if we develop these databases, which are open to the public, open to other researchers across the world, we can actually start teasing out some of these differences in PTSD, not only in baseline PTSD scanning, but also in treatment trials and other types of ways to deliver therapies and seeing if something's more effective in specific networks. So we can do this in disease-specific nodes like we had in this study where we said we looked at subgenual cingulate. We can do it in a data-driven approach where we look at blood flow, ICA, graph theory approaches where we look at connectivity across the whole brain and see if there's areas that we're missing because we're only looking in one specific spot. And using machine learning and AI algorithms to do this, we can get a better idea of the correlates with PTSD and possibly change the outcomes of these patients. As Derisha mentioned, we're doing this in a San Antonio Medical Foundation grant for Alzheimer's and dementia. This technique for transfer learning can be applied to different disorders in the same way. We're basically looking at the image and seeing if there's different parts of the image that we can interact with that actually give us better outcomes. At that point, over my time, I'd like to stop and ask you if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Felipe.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Felipe, this is Jeff. I do have a few questions that I'd like to ask. So first of all, you mentioned the use of different AI algorithms to enhance the efficacies or your treatment plans that you're building. I was wondering, how important is it when you're selecting these AI approaches that there is an output or a characteristic of the AI model that ties to explainable AI concepts? So instead of, do you use deterministic algorithms, or if they're black box models, how important is it in the medical application of these AI models that the underlying mechanisms that are being correlated together in the inside AI algorithm is explainable?
To be honest, in the TMS avenue, it doesn't have to be explainable at all. All of the stuff that people currently do in clinics for TMS applications are black box approaches. They literally just hope that they hit the area and hope that it does what it's supposed to do. And it works about 30% of the time. So there aren't actual metrics that need to be provided to show whether something's better than another, or one aspect is another, or one algorithm is better than the other. In the TMS planning aspect, supervised learning approaches are fine. People are sort of doing that now, but we don't necessarily need specific details of how things are working. Right now, we just deliver a plan and they go with it. It's not the same as in cortical surgical mapping where you actually need to have outputs and feedback and showing that this is working or not. This is basically just, we hope that we interact with the area, and using imaging, we can verify that we do, but it's not very necessary to have the outputs there.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. I'm thank you for that explanation. So the robotist in me wants me to ask how you constrain the motion of your robot. You know, you've got an industrial arm basically holding your magnetic coil that's placed really, really close to a patient's head. And it looked in your photo earlier that the patient was being restrained. So there was, you know, the patient's immobile. There's a industrial arm holding this tool right close to the head. And, you know, you're going through different, robotic motion, algorithms to be able to position it correctly. What control mechanisms and what safety protocols do you have to consider to be able to operate a industrial robot that close to a human?
So we severely limit its acceleration limits. So we decrease the speed that it can move around the head. Instead of moving like a robot very fast, it basically moves very, very slowly to a dedicated location, which is determined to not be around the head, and then plans from there. So when we determine the path planning, we actually have regions that we say are off limits using the ROS kind of system where we declare where the head is, where the table is, where the robot is. We register everything together and then say, these are boxes that you cannot go through. And so it basically says, okay, I can't go through this column here. I need to go to the other side of this area. I have to go up here first, over here, and then down. And so we programmed it basically using ROS to go around these areas that we declare as not interactable. We don't want to go through anybody's head. We don't want to do anything but basically just go onto the surface of their head. So there's a few ways to do that with digitization when we actually model where their head is. Forgive me, I'm not a roboticist, so I don't know the details. I know ROS system is what we use. And basically that's limiting the speed is how we keep the patient on the table as far as not being too scared to be around them. The restraint, by the way, is not necessarily for them to stay in place. It's mainly for them to not, like if they fall asleep during the treatments, we don't want their head to kind of wobble around because we're not actively following with the coil and the robot where their head is going. So
Yeah,
it's basically just to keep them stable, but they can easily move if they wanted to.
okay. So lastly and briefly, I'm curious about the actual mechanism, the neural mechanism that you think is being enabled using this EM field down at the neuron level, stimulating these individual neurons. So I keep thinking, I put an E field next to my head every time I put my cell phone up to my ear. There are other, studies or anecdotal stories that you hear about people under power lines. So if there is a actual mechanism that causes long-term effect, I mean, I get how you can, change what the neuron's doing short-term by applying an active field. But what you're showing is that there is this longer-term effect post-treatment that is lasting in this patient. So what differentiates that from other environmental electric fields or magnetic fields that a person would interact with, or even just MRI in general?
That's a very good question. It's all about field strength. So the magnetic fields that these coils create, they're on the same level as an MRI that you would get, about 2 or 4 Tesla. They're they decay very, very quickly with distance. So if you're 50 millimeters away from the surface of the coil, you don't really feel anything because their decay is so quick. We can turn up and turn down the current in the coil to make these stronger or weaker coils. The EM fields that you're getting naturally, whether you're out with your cell phone or by a tower or something like that, those are not the same scale as far as having a really strong EM field here, right on top of your head. So the long-term effects we're seeing are because of these high magnetic field strengths that we're generating locally. And we still have to do that over a month in order to get any kind of a measurable effect downstream. So the long-term effects, again, it's every single day, having it right here, right on top of your head, and it's a magnitude, an order of magnitude higher than you normally get if you had a cell phone there for an hour or other types of E fields. So I understand the hesitancy, but it's a different scale basically in the EM fields.
Oh, okay, great. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Felipe. Our next speaker is Mr. Tej Pandit. Tej, are you able to share your screen?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I will share my screen.
So Tej is a doctoral research assistant in my lab, actually, and he has received his master's degree from Rochester Institute of Technology, where he has received the Computer Engineering Department's Outstanding Graduate Student Award in 2018. And currently he's working on the DARPA project focusing on lifelong learning. And I believe he's going to be sharing about the concepts of lifelong learning in today's talk. The floor is yours, Tej.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Dr. K. Hi guys, I'm from the University of Texas, and I've been working under Dr. K for a while. Sorry, I was just getting this running. And I'm going to be talking today about the use of bio-inspired lifelong learning AI agents, and how we use these agents and the algorithms we develop in our lab to actually accelerate learning in the field, and also how some of the algorithms that we use can actually be used in applications. So let's get right into it. What exactly is lifelong learning, and what are the challenges that we face when we actually do lifelong learning? So when we talk in terms of lifelong learning, we imagine a sequence of tasks where every task is some kind of an activity which an agent needs to perform. And when we have the agent learn a task and then the next task and subsequent tasks like this, what we notice is that traditional AI algorithms tend to forget previously learned tasks whenever they learn the next subsequent task. This because it's the tendency of the AI agents to overfit and also greedily learn the information and overwrite information that it's already learned. So this is a particular challenge that we're trying to tackle right now. And some of the challenges, more concrete challenges that we've been facing are the one that I just spoke about, which is called catastrophic forgetting, where we forget previously learned tasks. Another problem is when we have a neural network that represents or that is used to learn these tasks, it has a fixed capacity, and hence by information theory, it states that the amount of information that you can learn in that network is also fixed. And that is a current limitation when we're looking to scale the number of tasks that we can learn. Another problem is in the absence of a supervising body where someone tells you, hey, this is what you're supposed to do, or this is not what you're supposed to do, can the agent learn? Because when you're learning in the field, you don't always have someone to hold your hand and guide you through these things. Another thing is the learning rate. So this refers to how fast your agent can incorporate the learned information into its system and how fast it can actually learn a new task. The learning cost here would be, well, the learning rate translates into learning costs, which could be how many times an agent needs to do something. For example, if you're training a self-driving car, you don't want it to keep driving into traffic or driving on the edge of a cliff, because that translates into real world costs. So this translates into learning costs, as well as hardware constraints. So the same example, you can't put a supercomputer into a car because you have limitations of power, and these translates to hardware constraints. So you have to optimize your algorithm so that it can make use of limited hardware. And these are some of the challenges that we face in lifelong learning. And we're going to talk about different algorithms and different mechanisms that we can use to tackle this. So the key algorithm or the key mechanism that I'm focusing on is neuroevolution and neurogenesis specifically. So neuroevolution here is the process of evolving or modifying the architecture of a neural network. Okay, and this consists of different types of mechanisms. One of them is neurogenesis, where you add nodes or neurons to the network. Synaptogenesis, where you can add new connections between these neurons, assuming the network isn't fully connected from the beginning. Then there is neuron termination, which is the removal of neurons which you don't find, which aren't contributing as much or aren't useful to the network and the learned information, as well as synapse terminations, which helps prune the size of the network and the number of connections that needs to be calculated. So this is the key feature which my research has been focused on. But in addition to this, there are more mechanisms such as neuromodulation, which is the process of adapting the internal state and the behavior of the AI agent such that it responds to observations with respect to the current context that it infers or perceives from its observations. So how this takes place within a network is you have a modulatory layer separate from the neural network, and that identifies which neurons in the network layer-wise are active or inactive, and which are active towards a particular task. This helps you, and then you can basically perform a modulation activity, which is similar to how a brain releases neuromodulators to actually control and temper our neuronal connections. Similarly, we can do the same thing artificially in a neural network and thereby progressively adapt these neurons and these connections to best fit the activity it's doing and produce the best system response for the particular task. Additionally, so what happens is here you'd see the active neurons and the connections that are formed with these active neurons are enhanced using these neuromodulators, whereas the inactive neurons, those are suppressed, and this enables you to get a better response towards a particular activity. On the other hand, metaplasticity, which is similar to neuromodulation in a particular way, but it's different in the fact that, and Dr. K spoke about plasticity just before, it's very important to the learning process. And metaplasticity here is the process by which we can actually modify the plasticity of neural network components, i.e. the neurons and the synaptic connections. This is done based on the past observed behavior of the components that are tracked with respect to time. And what we notice is that metaplasticity can be controlled based on either the activity of the neurons or the change in the weight of the connections, the history of the change in the weight of connections, as well as the temporal correlation between the activity and these changes in the neuron states. And then you can also have spike time dependent plasticity, which is something more tuned towards spiking neural networks rather than rate-based neural networks. And what we have here is that neurons which have been previously active have their plasticity reduced to actually help preserve the information that those edges have learned, whereas inactive neurons have their plasticity increased. That allows them to actually express multiple different, basically respond to multiple different stimuli and thereby incorporate new learned information. So some of the key questions that we're going to be answering here through this research is, one is, how do these mechanisms actually help lifelong learning specifically, and which of them are important for lifelong learning? And then also, very importantly, in the absence of a supervisor that provides explicit context of what task or challenge is taking place, how does neuroevolution and how does the agent learn? How does neuroevolution take place, and how does the agent learn these new tasks and information? And how does it adapt to that change that takes place between tasks? And lastly is which mechanisms in specific can aid information preservation, because we really need to focus on that, because that is one of the key problems in lifelong learning. So in my research, some of the main things that I was able to develop here was new rules that focus on neuroevolution and neurogenesis, the mechanisms that help preserve information by tracking the activity of the neurons in a network. We also developed simulated environments for evaluating this lifelong learning, because traditional learning environments aren't really built for lifelong learning in specific. And I'll come to that in a bit as to why we need special environments, as well as we built like a communication and a library for actually implementing these by tying these reinforcement learning algorithms to the simulations. So what exactly is reinforcement learning? Because I've been talking about that for a while, and we're going to define the context of this problem through reinforcement learning. Some of you already know what reinforcement learning is, but for those who don't, I'm going to quickly cover it. So we're going to cover it through an example. Here we have an agent, which is our AI control agent. For example, here it can be a spider. We're going to have positive and negative rewards, which we observe in basically every environment, even in our day-to-day life. Here, the negative reward is going to be fire, and a positive reward is going to be food, which is a bug. And we're going to have an environment which is kind of a maze, like an obstacle course for the agent to explore. And here we're going to have multiple different tasks which the agent has to do within the context of this environment or this maze. And it's going to have to learn these tasks in a sequence. And we're going to then evaluate to see, after a particular number of tasks, can it remember the original task and how well it can remember that task. So here is a quick look at what the environment looks like and the kind of inputs that the spider gets. So the spider has olfactory, auditory, and vibration inputs based on its distance from particular things in the environment. It can sense, it can see based on line of sight vectors that we receive. It's a simplified version of a spider that helps us, quickly run these algorithms and test their effectiveness. And the reinforcement learning paradigm, a quick look at how it exactly works. So we have an agent in the environment, and the environment provides observations to the agent through its senses that we've just seen. Based on that, the AI agent then uses the algorithm to then take actions in the environment. And the environment then evaluates those actions. In a natural environment, we would get rewards, or we would get a feedback from the environment around us. That's how we learn. But here we have to basically simulate different types of feedback that we get from these virtual environments. And these are simulated as positive and negative rewards. And based on this, the agent is able to update its own understanding of the environment and then take better and more optimal actions. So let's talk about the algorithm itself and the structure of the architecture which I'm proposing, which has been implemented to actually tackle this problem. So right off the basic implementation is a deep reinforcement learning network, which is essentially a feed-forward network which learns using traditional methods. It has multiple layers. It is sparsely connected. And what we do is we measure and we keep a track of the activity of the neurons as it learns in the environment and as it is exposed to different inputs. And we keep a track of this in a matrix. And this helps us and keep multiple stacks of these matrices to keep track over time, because it's required for the subsequent metrics that I'm going to talk about. So in this framework, we actually initially collect these network parameters. As I said, we collect not only the activations, we collect the weights, we collect the outputs. We also collect information from the environment itself, which is the score that the agent gets back, or a score that it self-develops for itself. It can be based off its own parameters, like its health and its well-being and its energy expenditure. So we have a score that is self-calculated, as well as the rewards which are received from from the environment. And when we've collected these network parameters, we then calculate a secondary intermediate state of metrics. these metrics are actually very important because they help us, there are higher dimensional metrics, and they help us actually keep track of important information within the network itself, such as not only the raw data from the network, but also how do these parameters compare in a local context, but not only in a global context. This helps us actually measure the the relative change of weights, the relative change in activities, also the change in the score that helps keep track of how well the agent is doing in its learning process. And these intermediary metrics are very important because we are able to separate them into different categories and thereby decide which metrics are important towards which end mechanism. And we then compare them to different thresholds. These are predefined thresholds based on the environment. And that helps us identify whether neurogenesis or synaptogenesis or the termination mechanisms for either of those are required within a network. So if a particular metric spikes, then we know that, hey, it's time for neurogenesis to take place. Or if another metric spikes, then we know that it's time to probably remove a particular set of nodes from the network. So now we're going to talk about exactly how these mechanisms work. We're not going to cover all of them, but a few of the important ones. So some of the neurogenesis mechanisms here. For one, the first one that we have is plateauing merit. So we keep track of the merit score. It's the evaluation, the self-evaluation of how well the agent is doing in the environment based on how many rewards it gets over time. And we noticed that if we keep track of the rate of change of this merit score, essentially the gradient, then the average gradient over a large period of, or over a small window of time, can actually tell us whether or not the agent's learning curve is plateauing. And this is very important because if the agent stops learning, we'll notice that the learning curve starts flattening out. And as soon as it starts flattening out, we notice that, hey, it's not learning anything more. And this could be because the network doesn't have enough node or connectional structure for actually learning this new information that's there in the environment. So we can add new nodes and perform neurogenesis to actually alleviate that problem. And if supposing there is no more information to learn, then those added nodes will automatically be pruned out because they don't learn anything. Another mechanism is by actually keeping track of the change in the weight magnitude for different connections within the network. Actually, by tracking the change in weight as compared to the absolute change in weight, or basically the change in the magnitude, whereas the absolute change in weight, we actually notice that the change in the magnitude will be pushed in, well, there's always change in the magnitude of a weight, whereas the change in the actual weight will actually tell us the direction in which the weight is being pulled. And what we notice is if both these quantities start diverging, both these quantities start diverging, that means that the learned information is trying to pull that particular weight in opposite directions. And that means that that particular node is trying to learn two different or opposing concepts. And that's not good because it causes the node to oscillate, which isn't really useful because it just keeps toggling back and forth. So it's only going to be able to represent one of these quantities, or worst case scenario, it's going to be able to represent an average of them, which is going to be somewhere in the middle. And so it's not going to be able to represent that idea well at all, neither of the two ideas. So in order to alleviate this problem, we actually produce an identical node with identical connections, and thereby one of the nodes can learn one of the concepts and the other node can learn the secondary concept. Thereby we alleviate the problem of causing two of the nodes fighting over the same information. And the third mechanism that we have is keeping track of the margin of confidence at the output. So at our output layer, we actually track how much the output neurons spike towards a particular input or input sequence. And we noticed that sometimes more than one, in the ideal case scenario, we want only one neuron to spike, thereby we know exactly which action to take. But sometimes, and more often than not, we notice that more than one neuron is active in our output layer. And if two of them are very similarly active at the high end, we say that they're basically fighting, and this translates into indecisiveness within the agent. So it could take this action, or it's very likely that within the next few steps, it may take the other action, which may not be the optimal one. So to increase this gap, we actually introduce new neurons so as to maximally separate these output confidences. And by adding a neuron in previous layers, we can actually create a relief mechanism, which allows you to learn enough information to separate these output representations. And then let's talk about how we actually evaluate this. So we created a set of simulated environments. I know some of the previous speakers have also created simulation environments, and they use ROS. ROS is a more physical based simulator, whereas here we were not trying to learn physics-based like locomotion or like trying to figure out how to walk or how to interact on a physics level. But here we were trying to actually solve tasks. So we created more visually appealing and more photorealistic environments as such. So we were trying to work on, this is an example of a simple environment, which is, we call it spider survival. You saw how the sensors worked. And before we trained the agent, we noticed the spider really, well, it's based on, it's a random representation. It's not learned anything. So it stumbles around. But after learning, and just after 60 minutes of training, it's able to actually explore the environment as well as learn how to interact with fire. We modeled it as a complex behavior such that it doesn't, if it touches the fire, it gets burnt, but if it goes too far away from the fire, it feels cold. So we know it's probably not realistic when it comes to bugs, but that's how we programmed it to see whether it could learn this complex interaction. But then we had to have multiple different tasks. That was task one. Task two is actually looking for food within the environment. So it has to basically find the bugs based on its olfactory senses. Task three is keeping away from a predator, where we couldn't program a snake. So I had a larger spider chase it around, and we could see how well it learns the environment and how it can actually learn to escape from the spider. And it's a little bit slower than the spider, so it has to really make use of the knowledge of the environment. We also tried for an example of the fourth thing to see how it would behave if we had two spiders in the situation, whether it would compete or it would coexist. And we noticed both types of behaviors. And we noticed that if you don't explicitly program offensive behavior, then they just act confused whenever they come into contact with each other. But then I thought, hey, maybe we need this is okay for quickly testing your algorithm, but probably we need a more real life task to evaluate how well these algorithms really do. So I created a second environment where we actually simulate a forest fire. So I create a random forest, and I light different areas on fire, and I trap different civilians inside that forest. And we have a drone which works as our agent, and we train it to actually explore the forest and how quickly it can actually explore the forest and find the people that are trapped inside and also lead them out to safety. And those are the tasks one after another. And you can see that it actually does learn even in a complex environment where it is processing complex visual inputs, that it can actually learn to navigate the environment as well as find the civilians that are trapped and also rescue them. So this was an attempt at making something that is more applicable, especially in light. This was developed in response to the California fires, no relation to them, but I was hoping to address them. And then the Australia bushfires also took place, which were quite severe. So it is a problem. And we can also notice that by training these agents in these realistic environments, we can actually train them to actually respond in real life situations. And I'll come to that in a moment, how that actually works. So some of the results, and I'm going to quickly go through this because this is just some results that we got. So one of the good things about this algorithm is that the algorithm is able to converge to a solution really quickly. So it's able to run really fast. So within 400 episodes, as compared to some of the algorithms which take thousands of episodes, it's able to learn much quicker. However, we did run this for the same amount of time. So it is taking longer to process the 400 episodes. So basically, the relational neurogenesis algorithm has larger computational overheads, although it is able to match the performance and also learn on an accelerated pace. And here we can also see how the neural network grows in response over time as it learns more information. This is a quick animation of how nodes are added as well as connections change. You can see that nodes are added as well as new layers are also added, depending on how much necessity there is to detangle more and more information. When we look at the continual learning performance, which is we train them on 1, 2, 3, 4 tasks, and then we evaluate them again on 1, 2, 3, 4, we notice that it's actually able to retain most of the learned information over the period of time. But more interestingly is when we look at the network size, and when we compare this to fixed capacity networks, you'll notice that for the same performance, when we compare, for example, relational neurogenesis with EWC, which is one of the best performing networks for continual learning, we notice that for the same size, it's able to learn within a much smaller network size. So you need not have such a large network size. You could actually work with a smaller network size and only add the network complexity as you increase the number of tasks. So it scales with respect to the number of tasks. So if you have a few tasks, you have a smaller size, whereas if you have a large number of tasks, you have a larger size, but obviously you need them to learn the information. And yes, this is only for 4 tasks. And if you scale them for more tasks, it will increase. It'll probably even cross EWC threshold. But what you notice is that as you increase the number of tasks, the performance of EWC, because it's a fixed capacity network, is going to fall. Whereas this allows you to actually grow without you having to intervene and change the hyperparameters. Another interesting find is the sparsity. So sparsity is the level of connections or the number of connections that you have at initial versus the end of the learning process. And you notice that independent of the initial sparsity, the algorithm actually converges to the same final sparsity. So this is very interesting. This tells us that the algorithm is actually finding an optimal solution for that particular problem, independent of how it is initialized, and independent of how dense the initial initialization is, as well as the performance, because it's able to achieve the same performance independent of the initial sparsity, because it does in the end converge to the same final sparsity. And the last thing that I want to talk about is a quick conclusion of the different things that we saw, is that this algorithm and neurogenesis itself is able to actually learn. It can continually incorporate information. It does grow, and it has the ability to grow the network as the number of tasks increases, but it also minimizes and optimizes the growth by pruning mechanisms, thereby preventing the network size from growing exponentially and exploding. Another key important thing is it doesn't need a supervisor, because it's able to track its own performance as well by using that gradient. And whenever there's a change in the task, it observes its own drop in performance and is able to switch tasks and know that, hey, a task has switched. But we do notice that this algorithm is very computationally expensive, and we're working on mechanisms to actually reduce this computation and make it more hardware friendly. We can also find another thing to look forward to is actually unifying these neuroevolutionary mechanisms and also incorporating algorithms that my friends have been working on in our lab, which is neuromodulation and metaplasticity, which actually I'm working on incorporating into this algorithm. We also want to transfer learn between virtual and real world scenarios. And I'll talk about why that's important in a second. So one of the things was the environments that you saw were initial early environments that I was developing. And as I learned the tools, I realized the importance for photorealism. So we've been working on improving the STEM environments. Here you can see are the latest iterations of these. And it's very important because we can actually then, if the simulated environment is virtually identical to the real environment, then we can actually do something called transfer learning. It's a different kind from the traditional AI transfer learning, in that we actually train it in the simulated environment, and we can test it directly in the real world environment if we have a 1:1 correspondence or a very near match. So it's very important for these environments to be as photorealistic as possible. It's also very important to test on diverse environments that differ in many different ways. So we can identify where the weaknesses of these algorithms lie and identify what things it can learn and it can't learn, and how long it takes to learn things, because some tasks are easy to learn, whereas some are very, very complicated. And as I said, photorealism is very, very important. And I am working on getting these new environments out so that other people can also test their algorithms on these things. And the last thing is I had to create some of these and program these environments, and it takes a long time to do so. So I'm working on procedural generation, which allows you to create essentially infinite variations of an environment, and thereby reducing overfitting to a particular environment. So an agent may do well on this particular forest fire, but it might not do well in a general forest fire. So we have to create infinite variations and new problems without hand modeling each scenario. So I'm working on procedurally generating these environments so that we don't have to sit hand modeling every single test case. Oh, well, that's all I have. Thank you so much for attending. And do you guys have any questions?
Thank you, Tej, for the presentation.
And I have a quick question. You know, these environments are really tremendous. And thank you, first of all, for a great presentation. I learned a great deal about, you know, creating environments and making them available for other people to test. How do you facilitate that sharing of environments so that that the community can continue to improve on these networks?
Are you talking about how I'm going to be sharing the environments?
Yes. How do you? Is there a good way within your discipline? This is not my discipline, so I'm asking. How do you facilitate sharing those environments so other people can use those?
Okay, so I'm just going to be making the environments available. We compile the environments. They have different parameters that you can tweak, and they're basically an executable that you can run on any computer.
Okay.
I think there are probably limitations to which computer, but yeah, you can just directly run them. You can control them yourself to play around. They're essentially a game engine. It's developed in Unity as compared to ROS. So actually you can manually control these very easily. And the same inputs that you would manually give, you can quickly tie them to an AI algorithm. We have a library that allows you to communicate between these two. So you can write a script in either Python or C# or Java or literally any language, because it communicates using sockets. And it's really easy. You just give the input from your code, and it allows you to make that action in the environment. And the environment sends back feedback using JSON packets. So it's if somebody wants to use your environment, then they would need to find your web page or whatever and be able to we'll be putting it on GitHub. So you'll be able to just download the environment directly.
Oh, got it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. There is something new that was just released. It's called Nvidia's Omniverse. And I haven't really worked in because it's very new, but it's a tool that allows me to develop these environments, and anyone in the world can then actually make changes in that environment or make a copy of that environment for themselves and actually modify the environment, not just use the environment. So that's a new technology.
Really interesting. Yeah, that's a great way to support your community. That's great.
Tej, real fast before we go to the next speaker, great presentation and some really great research. I love where you're going with this. So would you say that one of the outcomes of the research that you're working on is to create a more resilient method for doing human-inspired sparse learning? where we have fewer inputs required to get our models trained to an accurate end state. So, the traditional CNN approach of, just force feeding large amounts of curated data into a model to build those interconnections and then get those outputs. A human tends to learn much quicker. We have fewer exemplars that we see in the real world, and that retrains our model because we have that instant feedback loop. Something either is positive or negative, and so we instantly can get those interconnections in our biologic neural network to understand that faster than we've done historically with supervised learning approaches. Is this somehow related to the output of your research?
This is the ultimate goal, right? That we're all trying to achieve right now. This is actually a multifaceted question. So there are two different ways of looking at this, right? So one of the way is, sorry, there was a lot to unpack in that question. One of the ways is, I'm sorry, I've kind of lost the key. Can you just repeat the initial thing of the question just once?
It just, when I listen to your talk, I get inspired to think that one of the things that you're leading towards is an enhanced mechanism of building these AI approaches that don't require the vast amounts of curated data, that they learn quicker in real life scenarios.
Absolutely. So the thing is, when you talk about CNNs, right, they have, as you said, large data sets which have covered different hand curated data sets which have covered lots of different topics and lots of different examples. The problem is with this is that in CNNs, you need to keep being exposed to those images. So if it sees a particular image, it needs to be exposed to not only multiple variants of that image, but after it learns different types of images, it has to come back and replay those initial images. And that's a big problem because not only does that take a longer time to learn, but it also has to repeat this entire procedure, and it's not very naturalistic. Whereas when you have an environment like this, firstly, you don't have to curate the actual inputs. You only have to curate the environment, and then the agent will test every permutation and combination by just exploration. A second benefit of the algorithm itself here is that you don't have to train the entire network. You can only train particular sections of the network depending on, and you can focus your efforts on the weights by tracking the activity of the network in response to observations. So if it learns a particular type of task very well, then you don't need to focus that much on that task, and it can move on to another task. And the agent can automatically make these decisions for itself. And so you don't have to sit spoon feeding the environment, tweaking hyperparameters at every instance. And it is a step towards the right direction, but we definitely need more mechanisms to actually facilitate, as you said, learning from smaller number of samples. And this can only be done through context-aware and activity-aware mechanisms. And this is a step in the right direction, but it's not all the way there. Hopefully, with introducing metaplasticity and neuromodulation, it will bridge that gap a little bit more.
Well, you're on the right path. Keep up the great work. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Hi.
Hi, thank you, Tej. Our next speaker is Dr. Houpt. If you stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, just think.
Hello.
Hi. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Houpt, who is an associate professor of psychology who recently started here at UTSA. Prior to that, he was at Wright State University, which is one of my master's alma mater too. So great to see you here, Houpt. And his interest is in the intersection of psychology and AI, including using machine learning to better understand human interaction and human cognition, and also in the psychology of understanding human AI interaction. So he has been doing some really interesting work in this space using some mathematical modeling approaches as well. And a lot of his work has been funded by Air Force Office of Scientific Research and National Science Foundation. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Houpt, today. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited to talk to this group, and I've really enjoyed the earlier talks, so I'm happy to be a part of it. So the research I'm going to be talking about today is looking at how we can use mathematical models, mostly of human cognition, to get a better understanding of how people are interacting with either AI systems or other types of design systems. So the premise here is that when designing these systems, it's critical to understand how people use information. And the particular aspect I focus on is how people combine multiple sources of information to make decisions.
Sorry, we can see your slides.
Okay, let me try resharing again. Give me just a moment.
Yes.
All right, can you see the slides now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to lead the talk by talking a little bit about the methodology and the approach I use, and how we derive the various measures that we apply based on constructs from cognitive psychology. And then I'm going to talk about applications, looking at decision aids, warning systems, and then a case we use where we're looking at multispectral image fusion. So the broad framework that I apply for measuring in these domains is systems factorial technology. So this is a framework of addressing the general question of how different sources of information are combined in mental processing. And we can break this question down along 4 dimensions. One, whether the sources of information are used concurrently or one at a time. How many sources of information are enough to respond. Whether the knowledge of one source of information influences how we process other sources of information. And the extent to which adding more sources of information might degrade our efficiency with the existing sources of information. This first question we refer to as a system architecture. So how the information is used, whether in parallel or concurrently, or in series, one source of information at a time. In the special case of parallel information processing, whether people treat the separate sources of information as a single source of information, rather than considering them each separately, either in parallel or series. This question of how many sources are enough to respond can be framed in terms of a logical rule on a stopping. So for example, if to decide a person uses multiple sources of information, that might be framed as an exhaustive processing rule or an AND rule on the logic of information processing. And that type of rule could be combined with either parallel or serial information processing. In contrast, it might be a first terminating. So as soon as I've dealt with one source of information, I'm done. I know how to respond and move on. And again, that could be with a parallel system. So it ends up being kind of a race between the sources of information, or a serial system. Whatever I focus on first, I use that to make my decision. In terms of measuring how one source of information affects another, we usually put this in the context of just stochastic independence. So the information processing on one source, if we look at the joint distribution, it can split into the product of those distributions. So using that sort of formal definition from probability theory. And if you don't get that product representation, we'd say there's some influence between the processes. The next construct, and this is one that we found to be very valuable in evaluating system design, is workload capacity. So in this sense, it's a question of how adding more sources of information changes processing. The diagram here would be if I have a resource, maybe attention or foveated vision or something, how it changes as I go from one to two things. On this side here, this would be I've got one thing to focus on, and maybe I've got this 50% of the circle of resources. But if I have two things to focus on, I have to divide that up across the two. So it would be a limited capacity system. Contrast that with an unlimited capacity resource, or if I've got one source of information to focus on, I can use the same amount of attention or processing resources if I also have a second source of information, so it doesn't negatively affect me. And then sometimes what we see show up in special cases of the way we use information is that I'm actually more efficient with each source of information if I have multiple together. And so this might be a sort of ideal target, this or unlimited capacity for system design relative to limited capacity design. So it's a very quick high-level overview of some of the terminology I'm going to use. Again, a reminder, architecture, whether people are using information in series or in parallel. Stopping rule, if how much information, how many of the information sources people need to use to make their response or to make a decision. The workload capacity, so how information processing might degrade as more sources of information are added. And then the dependence among sources, the extent to which the content of one source of information influences our understanding, our use of the other source of information. All right, so those are the broad constructs. I'll shift into measures now. So the first measure I'll talk about is the workload capacity coefficient. And this is a measure of how changes in processing the parts is influenced by increasing the number of sources of information. To derive this measure, we fix a baseline of performance. We refer to as the UTSA model because we assume unlimited capacity for the baseline. So we're assuming no changes as I increase the sources of information available for the efficiency on each source, independence of processing, and that it's parallel. We use this model of a baseline then to take information about how people use each source of information and compare that to how they, each source in isolation, and then parcel out that information to get sort of how efficiently people are combining information. The logic of the derivation is relatively straightforward if you're used to dealing with probabilities. I'm going to not go through it in too much detail, just kind of flip through what it looks like. But if it doesn't make sense, I'm happy to talk about it ad nauseum later, or just be comfortable in the fact that the derivation's out there. So for a first terminating stopping rule, the idea might be that you're done, you're only not finished if you haven't finished any source of information. In terms of probabilities or completion times, it might look like this. If you assume unlimited capacity independence, I'm dropping some reference there to the context of the information. The independence rule means I can split that into a product. These are in terms of survivor functions. If you're familiar with those, that's just a rewriting of what the probabilities say. And the logarithm of those puts things in terms of cumulative hazard functions. That's sort of a convenience for measurement. There's nice properties of these things for statistical estimation. There's also an interpretation of hazard functions as sort of being a work in the system kind of thing from survival analysis. The main point here, though, is that if I focus on these measurements of the work in the system for this baseline prediction, dealing with one source of information, I can just add that to the work in the system from the other source of information to get my baseline prediction of how the system would do things under this baseline unlimited capacity independent parallel processing system. There's versions of this for other stopping rules, but basically it's that idea that we have some combination of work for each source of information. I can put them together to get a prediction for the baseline. What I do then is then take that baseline as the measurement scale for how well people actually do. So I can predict how well somebody would do with an auditory take how long somebody takes to respond to an auditory signal, how long somebody takes to respond to a visual signal, and predict how quickly they would respond to the joint signal. And if people are better, that means they're using that information together more efficiently. So again, this measurement provides a yardstick to measure change in performance due to workload, while controlling for how efficient people are with each source of information. And it's a response time-based measure, so this is sensitive to different characteristics of cognitive processing. The other measurement focuses in on how the sort of the structure of information processing, so the serial versus parallel, as well as the number of sources of information. Basically, if we have a measure here where I can influence how quickly you're using each source of information, this diagram isn't great, so maybe I'll just skip over it. We look at an interaction contrast as we speed up and slow down different sources of information. And with this interaction contrast, it turns out there's unique predictions of how that contrast would look following each of these combinations of information processing order or architecture and the information processing stopping rule. And so, for example, if I focus on this system, this is representing a parallel exhaustive system. So, for example, if I've got an audio and visual warning, that participant or that operator is going to wait till they've detected both warnings before they make a decision or make a response. But they're processing that information in parallel. So, auditory cortex dealing with stuff at the same time as visual cortex. That might be contrasted with a system where they're really only focusing on the auditory information. And as soon as they detect an auditory signal, they respond to that signal. And so under those contrasting systems, if I'm speeding up and slowing down the auditory and visual information, I get distinctive patterns for that interaction contrast. What that allows me to do is if I manipulate the sources of information, I can measure these interaction contrasts from an operator or participant and use those to infer what kind of information processing structure they were using. And that might be useful depending on the design of the system, where we want people to say, for example, not treat this different sources of information as distinct. So we want to design towards a more coactive system, or we want to keep people able to use the distinct information sources, but maybe respond as soon as they've figured out a solution based on either source. Okay, so those very quick overview of the type of information processing measures we're using and the constructs we're using for them. Switching into applications, we've used this task of a line length judgment task to look at a number of different ways that changes to a decision aid might influence the way people combine the information from the decision aid with their primary task. So the setup here is that they just see a bar on the screen. They're asked whether they should attempt production, so the bar is short enough, or not, it's too long, sort of indicating it's not high quality material. And at some point they might get a recommendation from a decision aid that indicates this is the decision aid thinks this is quality material, or it thinks it's not quality material. And then during that process, the person makes that decision either just using their own sort of direct judgment of it. So that would be a serial first terminating processing system, or maybe they make their decision, wait for the decision aids, use the information together to make the final decision. Might be a sequential or a serial exhaustive process. Or perhaps they're able to actually combine those two cues depending on the display design to make a sort of joint decision with all of the information together. So for example, we can look at display design characteristics. how the reliability of the decision aid influences people, and then how people's experience with the decision aid over time might influence the way they use that information. So let's see. So one experiment we've done with this setup is looking at different training conditions with the color aid. So in this one, we had 4 different groups of people. Some groups were trained with a perfect decision aid. So their experience before doing the primary task, they never saw an error from the decision aid, versus some that saw a very accurate but not perfectly reliable aid. And then another contrast we were interested in is whether the sort of how important the information was to the person might influence the way they used it. So whether they were focusing on information, they were either told about a performance incentive before the task or after they'd completed the task. So, the better they did, the more money they earned. So in this task across the board, we saw evidence of essentially serial first terminating processing. Whether or not they knew about the reward and whether or not they'd trained with the perfect aid, they tended to either make the decision based on just their own direct perception of that line or based on the aid's recommendation. And in fact, there was a mixture within people and across people. They weren't always just using the aid or always using their own decision. They did seem to vary across trials on that. So again, these are the survivor interaction contrasts. There's only one that had this pattern of parallel exhaustive information. Otherwise, people really just focused on, 2 that had that pattern. Everyone else tended to focus on just one source or the other. These are those capacity coefficient measures. So this, the baseline here is 1. So that would be they are equally efficient using each source separate as they are using the 2 sources together. So making the decision their own or relying entirely on the aid would be the 2 individual sources of information. We combine those using the baseline to see how well people do relative to that baseline. And the only condition where we really saw people be more efficient with the 2 sources of information together rather than just aid alone or just the line alone, was this condition when they actually didn't know about the performance incentive until afterwards, and they were trained with the imperfect aid. So there was something about the way they were able to calibrate their performance without the sort of, the pressure of that decision, the pressure of the additional financial incentive that led on the average for group people to use that information more efficiently. And then interestingly, when they knew about the aid and were trained, knew about the reward and trained with the imperfect aid, they were actually the least efficient at combining those sources of information. Very quickly, this one of the things we noticed, if you change levels of automation, so here, L4 refers to when people get a recommendation from the system and make the decision. L5 refers to a level of automation where the user basically has a supervisory. The automation says we're going to do this, and the user basically says yes or no. And we saw this big effect of people experiencing the automation first with that decision aid context, and then moving to a context where they were supervising the system. So when they initially had that experience, they get a lot faster at responding with that aid when they move to the supervisory system. And that's not a training effect, and we don't see that with the opposite ordering. We used an accumulator model. Again, this is the kind of thing I'll just have to flash up here, and then if you want to know more about it, I'm happy to talk about it. But it's a way of separating out bias in responses from how efficiently people use information. And essentially the story here is that what happened is people were much needed a lot less information to make their decision if they had this kind of sequence. So the big difference that showed up here was really in how biased people were towards going with the automation's recommendation. So this is a hint at a way that we might be able to build trust or allow people to calibrate trust in a decision aid better, is have them work first as a decision aid and then later work with it as a supervisor. I think I've probably, I don't know what time I've started, but I think I've gone kind of slow through my slides. So I'll go fairly quickly through some of these other applications.
You're really fine. So
Oh, okay. Excellent.
You'll be fine.
Great. Well, then I won't rush too much. Thank you. This next task, we were looking at this construct of ecological display design. So we worked with researcher Kevin Bennett, who's really developed a lot of theory in display design, looking at essentially building the task constraints into the display design. So we sort of what would make this the easiest task possible from the constraints of the environment. So we added a threshold queue here for the bar that on average, if it's the bar crosses this threshold, then it's too long. And if it's below the threshold, it's short enough. So trying to make that as easy as possible. We also added the the aid here in this color queue situation, either to the bar itself or to this threshold, to see if people still got additional advantage from the decision aid, or if that threshold display was enough, or and looked at the contrast there. It turns out, for the most part, these are kind of noisy because we didn't have as many people in these. So this summary statistic kind of gives a better idea. But this threshold present absent, this is whether we're using that ecological interface versus the raw interface. And then we looked at an easy or difficult judgment. So how much the good quality and poor quality line lengths overlapped. And pretty much across the board, we saw that people were less efficient using the aid together with that raw information. So they got worse dealing with both of those together. But interestingly, while people were perhaps a little bit more efficient with using the aid when that threshold bar was involved, generally speaking, there just weren't big differences in there. So the display design here didn't give us a big advantage in general, nor did it take away from any potential advantages of the decision aid or add to them. There's also a version of ecological interface design, or I guess a different kind of viewpoint in display design, configural display design, where the idea is to build display objects based on things that are configural in perception. So color and shape, so the length of the bar being the target information, tends to be what we call separable color and shape tend to be separable dimensions. So it's very easy to focus on just the length of an object or just the color of the object and distinguish those things. That's in contrast to the width of an object. So the way we process width information can interact with the way we process length information. So even though these two bars are the same length, the skinnier one maybe looks a little bit longer. And that's a sort of indicator of configural information processing. So length and width tend to go together, color and length not so much. So our question was, if we take the decision aids information and we put it into the decision environment using a configural queue, does that change the way people use the information, potentially forcing them to use it maybe more efficiently relative to color cues? And in this case, when people are told to use the information separately, so they can either use the automated queue or their own judgment, people are fairly inefficient, again, with both area and color. So they're below this. The statistic is 0 as the baseline. Sorry for that being a little different than the other graphs I've shown. But we do see when we force people to use or we tell people to use both sources of information, we see an advantage for the color display over the area display. So the separable dimensions allowing people to kind of treat those two different sources of information separately allow them to be a little bit closer to unlimited capacity, so equally efficient with the two together relative to when we use that configural queue and sort of force the people to use perceptual system components that are more combined. Moving into a different example application of this type of information, we did some work looking at multi-sensor image fusion. So a lot of surveillance systems have visible sensors and then sensors for other areas of the spectrum. In this case, we used a number of different sensors. This example is looking at long-wave infrared and visible system. There have been a number of algorithms proposed for how it might be useful to combine different sensors to give operators a single video stream or source of information on which to make decisions. So there's a large number of algorithms. These algorithms are usually evaluated from the perspective of how much information is preserved from each of the sources, but much more rarely evaluated from the perspective of how efficiently people can actually use that information. So one of the frameworks we've used called ideal observer analysis looks at efficiency a little bit different than the capacity coefficient, but similar kinds of ideas. How efficiently people extract information from an image from a thermal sensor, and how efficiently people extract information from a visible sensor, as well as how efficiently people extract information from a fused image. So this gives us an idea of not just, building on the ideas of how much information is preserved by an algorithm, we also want to know how much of that information people are able to continue to use. And so using this measure, we can compare across tasks and across different fusion algorithms to get an idea of how well people are extracting information. So to orient you a bit here, people are generally very bad at extracting information in more complicated image streams. Part of this just comes from the fact that an ideal observer, a computer algorithm, can use a random pixel that's not really related to the task to distinguish from training images. So it's kind of a good thing that people don't use that because it's not a very robust way of using information. But part of it is just that our visual acuity doesn't extract every bit of information in an image. So this is less than 1% of efficiency here for this task. The shovel task is sort of this environment. There's just a person holding a shovel on the left or right side. So looking across the different algorithms, we see not a lot of distinction. This Laplace fusion algorithm, this is one of the pyramid fusion algorithms, if you're familiar with that domain at all, ends up being less efficient, so people aren't as good at extracting information. Some of these other ones do a little better. It actually turns out that for that task, the thermal alone, people were the most efficient at. Contrast this with a much simpler environment. So there was just a Landolt C. So it was a physical Landolt C that we're imaging that had a heat source behind it, and it was did block the thermal information. So these are still physical images, but much more simple than this outdoor task. Here, this maxed rule ended up being absolutely miserable. People were terrible at getting information out of that relative to what was in there. And in fact, the visible alone information ended up being the most efficient for them to use. We can also look at image fusion from the perspective of how people combine information using that the SIC and capacity analyses. So one question we wanted to evaluate was whether if we just gave people the two image sources side by side, if they could even use that information in parallel, meaning that it might be possible that they could have all the information available to them, potentially use it in a more efficient way, without having to sacrifice and slow things down by having to do sequential, say first focus on one source and then another. So in the task, they either saw a visible only sensor, the thermal long wave infrared sensor, or they saw the two together. And in that task, so we only had 7 people do this task, but 5 of the 7 were able to use that information in parallel. Some tended to respond as soon as they detected information in either sensor, and some waited to use information from both sensors. And a couple did just focus in on a given trial, one sensor or another. We could also compare that using the capacity coefficient to how efficiently people use the information in a fused image. Here, this was using the Laplacian pyramid fusion. So looking at the efficiency, all 10 of our participants were limited capacity with the fused images. So they were less efficient at using the 2 sources of information together with the fused image than they were using the predicted baseline performance. They actually did a little better with the side-by-side fusion. 5 of the 9 were limited, 4 of the 9 were unlimited, so no worse with the 2 sources together than they were with these sources individually. But all 9 of the participants that we got clean data from were more efficient with this side-by-side presentation than the fused imagery. I don't have the data here, but in talking to people that use these sensors in surveillance, often what they have is a switch or a little knob. They can use the visible feed, the long wave infrared feed, or the fused feed. And my understanding from speaking to them is a lot of them essentially ignore the fused feed and end up, if they want to do fused, they flick back and forth. So they just switch the knob back and forth between the 2 sensors. So we did a follow-up, and that I don't have the data here, but of the people we ran, they were most efficient with that flicker fusion where it just bounces back and forth, and that allows people to kind of align the information spatially as well. So one of the critical take-homes for this is that even though the information preservation might look very good from a sort of like an image processing perspective, that doesn't necessarily translate into people being able to use that information efficiently. The next domain here is multimodal queuing. So this one, simple detection task, just play a tone, flash a light. People generally are able to use that more efficiently than each separately. This is a pretty well-studied phenomenon. We were curious in virtual environments if spatial audio help with orientation. Short answer here is not really. So again, we're back to 1 as the baseline. People were generally below baseline, identifying objects in the environment, or figuring out where objects in the environment were relative to themselves in that environment, using both auditory and visual information together relative to either of those sources alone. We also had a search task, so a more simplistic environment looking for a Landolt C, where they might have, they wore a tactile belt that gave them information about orientation of the target and had spatial audio, and then had this primarily visual task looking for this. Here, people were much better in that 360 environment at finding a target when they had any cue, and there didn't seem to be a much additional advantage of a tactile cue on top of having the spatial auditory cue. This participant was interesting. They actually weren't aware that the tactile belt had anything to do with the task. So there was sort of an indication there that this blue line, they didn't get as much of an advantage, although they did get some advantage from that tactile cue. All right, so sorry to kind of speed through those last few slides, but the general point here is that understanding how people use information is fundamental to how we design our systems. In many of the cases when we're putting together information, particularly with decision aids and recommender systems, people combine information from multiple sources of information, from multiple sources to make their decision. I presented a framework for addressing this general question of how we combine information in cognitive processing, looking at both the capacity coefficient that measures those changes as I add more information relative to the baseline, as well as the survivor interaction contrast, which we use for getting at the structure of information processing. And then I very briefly talked on the use of accumulator models to figure out sort of why people speed up or slow down, and ideal observer analysis for looking at how efficiently people are extracting information. And this work's been supported by AFOSR, ORISE, in support of the Air Force Research Lab, and the NSF as well. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Houpt. I believe there is one question.
Hi. Hey, Doctor. Hi. I do have one question. Could I ask it? Okay.
Please.
Okay. So while combining these multisensory inputs, have you noticed or observed any bias or preference for any particular type of input or sensor type which dominates or is predominantly dominant over other types, which you've observed over your wide set of experiments? For example, you did the color versus dimension, right? So like that, for example, was any particular one dominant?
Yeah, it ends up being task dependent. So people are fairly good at learning the task environment and being sort of adapting to what the most informative cues are. So in the image fusion examples, depending where that guy was standing, if he was standing in front of the tree, there was a really strong thermal contrast and not a very good visible contrast. So making decisions about it, people tended to be more biased towards using the thermal information. Looking at the auditory and visual tasks, so the auditory, like the neural processing of auditory information is much faster than the visual processing. There's sort of less complexity involved in it. But depending on how complex the decision is, people can be faster with auditory or visual information. So depending on the complexity of the task, we might see a bias towards people using more auditory for more simple tasks or more visual for more complex tasks.
I see, but it is task dependent that way.
It is, absolutely, yeah, and training dependent. People are very good at learning well, not optimizing, but moving towards a more optimal balance and bias in the environment.
I see. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Bye.
I have a quick question. We're doing some research that involves synthesizing information from images, basically recreating a natural auditory stream from a soundless image.
Interesting.
And one of the things that we're thinking that it might be useful for, because it's kind of a solution without a problem right now. So we're thinking that it's possible that this might be useful in an environment where we want to provide more stimulation or more information to a user that so if you're scanning the environment with one of these AI systems and you notice an event, you might, the observer or the user may not have observed the same event. And if it's one of these characterized critical event, like a car moving towards the user or a train moving or some kind of an event like that, that if we overlaid the synthesized sound time synchronized to the environment, it might provide a higher degree of fidelity of information to the user that they can then react to. It also, we're thinking about it possibly for, sensory deprived individuals where there's a decreased level of sensitivity in one of the sensory inputs that we can then overlay information on. But I'm just wondering, is it a valid hypothesis to think that if we create a more natural occurring sound for the environmental effect that we're trying to characterize, that information creates higher fidelity for the user than if we just do like a loud beep?
So I think I believe so. So one of the advantages of having more ecological sounds is that you can build a more complex auditory environment. So there might be multiple things in the environment that might be important to the user's attention. And if they're all doing beeps, it's very difficult for that person to decide which one needs their attention first. So, sort of picture in a hospital room and everything's beeping and alarms are going off everywhere. It's much more overwhelming than on a city, out on a city corner, there's much more information, but we're sort of better at tuning to what the more important sources of information are. So I think there's absolutely value in environments where there's the potential for multiple auditory inputs. The other thing that can be helpful is with attentional orienting. So if somebody's in an environment where they're not looking directly at the object, having sound from that object that matches it already starts to give them information about what it is before they've looked at it. So, knowing if it's a car coming at me, I might detect movement out of the corner of my eye. If I can hear that it's a car, that's very different information than I hear that it's a bicycle or a pigeon or something like that. So I think the additional cues of identity could be very useful, particularly in situations that require very quick responses, or I might want information before I have the chance to turn my head and look.
Yeah, great. We if you don't mind, we might want to follow up on that later on.
Yeah, please do. That sounds really interesting.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Houpt. We really appreciate and enjoyed your presentation today. It really added a new dimension to our discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed the questions and the opportunity to talk about it.
Fantastic. Well, this was going to conclude our workshop today. We had thought we could have some time for discussion, but honestly, the presentations were really engaging and we had some really good questions afterwards. I'd like to give very special thanks to Dr. Salinas, Mr. Pandit, and Dr. Houpt for providing such stimulating presentations. The goal of our Sweeter community is to help connect people to resources, to help people understand what the different computational needs may be throughout our university, throughout our systems, as this connects several university systems together. And so as we're learning from each other in these computational spaces, also paying attention to what kinds of resources we need to be providing through UTSA and our partner institutions, and also thinking about how we can connect with the, yes, the computational resources, but the resources of the people themselves and the type of different platforms we can work on interdisciplinary to help solve these problems that occur at disciplinary boundaries. So I'd also like to just take a moment to give my sincerest thanks to Dr. Griffith, who has really helped us through Matrix, Dr. Darisha Kaduthapudi, who's also been very gracious to be our partner on this workshop, and Sanchita Ghosh for all of her work on putting this together as well. As Jeff mentioned in our initial start off to the event, we will be having more of these. I think our next one we're hoping to do with OCI, with our Open Cloud Institute, and focus on different research that's happening in that space. And so we hope to see you there. I hope you're enjoying your summer, getting some research done in between our semesters. And thank you again for attending this Sweeter workshop. Have a great day.